The year is 976. In Cordoba, southern Spain, a city ruled by Africans, over 500,000 people live with streetlights, running water, hospitals, and public libraries. Children go to school, poets read verses under orange trees, black African philosophers teach medicine and math. Meanwhile, Europe north of the mountains still burns witches and fears comets. One scholar in the caliph's court oversees a library said to contain more books than all of Christian Europe combined, and that scholar is African. But centuries later, when Europeans tell the story of the Renaissance, they leave out Cordoba, they leave out the Moors, they leave out Africa. For centuries, the world was taught a eurocentric fable, that civilization was the gift of Europe to the rest of humanity, while Africa existed in darkness. A place without history, without progress, without meaning. In classrooms, museums and media, most people were taught that Europe built, Africa followed. Europe thought, Africa obeyed. Europe led, Africa remained behind. But this narrative could not be any more false. In truth, Africa civilized Europe. Yes, Africa civilized Europe, and history tried to hide it. The evidence was simply hidden away by those who could not bear to credit a black continent with such glory. But today, we're here to uncover it. If you're ready to question everything you were taught in school, if you're ready to unlearn the myth and hear the truth, then give this video a like to show your support. And let's begin this remarkable journey back to Africa's forgotten legacy. In the beginning, Africa was already there, home to some of the earliest great civilizations on Earth. Long before the glories of Greece or Rome, the African continent nurtured powerful kingdoms, advanced knowledge, and monumental achievements that would lay the groundwork for world civilization. The most famous of these was ancient Egypt, whose pyramids stood as awe-inspiring marvels while Europe's tribes still wandered in prehistory. The Egyptians charted the stars, engineered stone colossi, practiced medicine, and devised a calendar, achievements Europeans would later emulate. Egypt was, in every sense, a beacon of high culture in antiquity, and ancient Greeks recognized this fact. When we picture classical Greek philosophers and mathematicians, figures like Thales, Pythagoras, Plato, or Euclid, we imagine the marble halls of Athens or Alexandria. But we must remember that many of these great minds traveled to Africa to learn from Egyptian masters. According to historical accounts, nearly all the major Greek thinkers of the early era studied in the temples and mystery schools of the Nile Valley, absorbing African wisdom and scientific knowledge. They carried this knowledge home, effectively transplanting ideas that had matured in African soil into Europe's intellectual life. Pythagoras, legendary for his theorem, spent 22 years in Egypt studying mathematics and philosophy before the Persians invaded. He was even initiated into the Egyptian priesthood, a rare honor for a foreigner. The very concept of a philosophic academy may have been inspired by the structured mystery schools of Egypt. In short, African teachers educated Greece's founding geniuses, seeding the ideas that would bloom in European thought. Concrete evidence of this intellectual debt is plentiful. For instance, the number system used in ancient Greece, the alphabetic numerals used by Archimedes, Aristotle, Euclid and others, was not a Greek invention at all. It was borrowed from the Egyptians. Modern research revealed striking similarities between the Greek numeral system and Egypt's demotic numerals. Greek traders, encountering Egypt's convenient way of writing numbers, simply adopted it for themselves. Imagine that. Even the way Europeans learned to count owes a debt to Africa. So much for the notion that Greeks conjured civilization out of a vacuum. They drank deeply from Africa's well of knowledge. African influence extended beyond Egypt too. To the south lay Nubia, the kingdom of Kush, which built its own pyramids and at times ruled Egypt itself, proving that high culture was not confined to one corner of the continent. In North Africa, centuries later, Carthage rose as a wealthy seafaring republic that rivaled Rome. The great Carthaginian general Hannibal, an African, nearly toppled the Roman Republic in the 3rd century BCE, leading an army with war elephants from the African forests over the Alps, a feat that has echoed through history. While Rome ultimately defeated Carthage, it was clear that African power and ingenuity could match Europe's might. Even after Rome conquered Carthage, Africa remained integral to the empire's story. Many prominent Romans were African by birth. The city of Alexandria in Egypt, with its towering lighthouse and grand library, became the intellectual capital of the classical world. There, scholars of all lands, Greek, Roman, Jewish, African, mingled and advanced human knowledge together. It was on African soil that Euclid wrote his treatises on geometry and Ptolemy charted the heavens. Later, in Roman times, St. Augustine of Hippo, born in what is now Algeria, built the theological foundations of Western Christianity as one of the Church's most important fathers. He was a Roman African, a dark-skinned man from the edges of the Sahara. Yet his writings shaped medieval European thought on God, sin, and salvation. By the twilight of antiquity, one could not deny Africa's imprint on European civilization. Yet, as the Roman Empire crumbled in the West, a dangerous forgetfulness set in. Europe entered a chaotic era, the so-called Dark Ages, in which much of the old knowledge was lost or ignored. In this vacuum, later Europeans would develop an arrogant myth that civilization had been solely their own creation, springing from Greece and Rome, while Africa stood outside history. Nothing could be further from the truth. Africa's torch had illuminated the classical world, and it was about to rekindle civilization in Europe's darkest hour. The fall of Rome in the 5th century plunged Western Europe into turmoil. Without an empire to maintain roads, schools, and libraries, much of the continent slipped into illiteracy and disarray. Europe's Dark Ages had begun. Centuries of poverty, war, and intellectual stagnation. But while the light faltered in the north, civilization was still blazing brightly in Africa. In fact, during this same era, the world's most cultured and learned societies were predominantly African, as noted by renowned historian Cheikh Anta Diop. As Europe languished, great empires rose and thrived south of the Mediterranean. Africa's Middle Ages were a golden age of learning and prosperity, and it was only a matter of time before this African brilliance would extend a guiding hand to Europe once more. After Rome's collapse, the torch of knowledge passed largely to the Eastern world and the Islamic civilization, which emerged in the 7th century. North Africa was among the first regions absorbed into the new Islamic caliphates. Cities like Cairo, Kairouan, Fez, and Timbuktu became bustling centres of commerce and scholarship. In these cosmopolitan African hubs, ancient Greek texts were translated into Arabic, studied and preserved at a time when few in Europe could even read them. It is a profound irony. The wisdom of Aristotle and Galen survived the Dark Ages not in European monasteries, but in African and Middle Eastern libraries. African scholars were among the leading lights of this Islamic golden age. In Kairouan and Fez, universities were established that drew students from across the Muslim world. The University of Al-Qarawiyyin in Fez, founded in 859 AD by a visionary African woman named Fatima al-Fihri, stands as the oldest continually operating university on Earth, older by centuries than Europe's first universities. This fact alone shatters the notion that higher learning is a European invention. Meanwhile, powerful African kingdoms flourished further south. In West Africa, the Empire of Ghana grew rich on gold and trade. impressing even distant observers with its wealth and order. It would be succeeded by Mali and Songhai, empires whose cities like Timbuktu housed grand mud brick universities and libraries. Yes, in the 12th and 13th centuries, while Oxford and Paris were just beginning to germinate as learning centres, Timbuktu had already amassed tens of thousands of manuscripts in astronomy, medicine, law and poetry. Travellers from North Africa and the Middle East marvelled at Timbuktu's book markets and its learned professors. The Malian emperor Mansa Musa became legendary for his wealth and piety. When he journeyed to Cairo in 1324, his lavish spending of West African gold supposedly caused a currency crisis in Egypt. Here was Africa's medieval golden age, a time when African rulers, scholars, architects and artists stood second to none. The idea that Africa was a continent in darkness during the Middle Ages is pure fiction, a lie born from later slave trading prejudice. In reality, Africa was a continent of kingdoms, culture and innovation, while much of Europe struggled simply to feed and govern itself. Nowhere is the contrast more striking than in basic living standards and education. In Christian Europe around the 8th century, the vast majority of people, up to 99%, were illiterate, including many kings and nobles. Knowledge of science or medicine was minimal. Superstition filled the void. By contrast, in the great cities of the Islamic world, many of them on African soil, literacy was far more common and scientific inquiry flourished. Libraries existed in places like Cordoba, Cairo and Timbuktu, when Europe had almost none. To be sure, Europe was not entirely stagnant. There were sparks of light in a few monasteries and in the Byzantine East. But compared to the dynamism across Africa and the Middle East, Europe was a backwater. Enter the Moors. In the year 711 AD, an army led by General Tariq ibn Ziyad crossed from North Africa into Europe, landing at the rock that still bears his name, Jabal Tariq, or Gibraltar. This force was a mix of Berber North Africans, the indigenous peoples of Morocco and Algeria, many of whom had embraced Islam, and Arabs from the Middle East. By medieval and modern accounts, a significant number of these Moors were dark-skinned Africans. So much so that in later European language, Moor became virtually synonymous with black African. Within a few years, these African-led forces swept through most of the Iberian Peninsula, modern Spain and Portugal. The old Visigothic kingdom of Spain crumbled before them. Europe, which had seen waves of barbarian invaders, now beheld something entirely new, an African conquest, not of savagery, but of civilization. Unlike other invaders, the Moors did not bring ruin. They brought enlightenment. They came not to loot or burn, but to build. They arrived swift as leopards, their faces black as pitch, and struck fear in the Gothic knights. But after the battles were won, these conquerors set about establishing a new society, one that would utterly transform Iberia. Africa had returned to Europe, this time as a civilizing force. Over the next several decades, the Moors, joined by more immigrants from Morocco, Egypt, and even as far as Senegal and Nigeria, consolidated a realm known as Al-Andalus. They chose Cordoba as their capital. At its peak, Moorish Spain would be ruled by a caliphate that rivaled the greatest kingdoms of the world. For the first time in centuries, much of Western Europe was being governed by sophisticated administrators and scholars, many of whom were African or of African descent. They introduced crops previously unknown in Europe: rice, sugarcane, cotton, citrus fruits, revolutionizing agriculture. They brought advanced techniques in irrigation, turning Spain's arid lands into verdant gardens. They built cities with paved streets, running water, street lights and hospitals, leaping centuries ahead of the rest of Europe in infrastructure and public amenities. It was as if a slumbering continent had been jolted awake by a cultural infusion from Africa's thriving civilization. As the Moors established their rule in Iberia, Europe's Dark Ages were gradually brought to an end. Imagine a traveller crossing the Pyrenees Mountains from the brutish kingdoms of medieval France into Al-Andalus around the year 1000. On the French side, they would find muddy villages, warlords in wooden forts, widespread illiteracy, and superstition-ridden clergy. But upon entering Moorish Spain, that same traveller would step into a dazzling urban civilization centuries ahead of its time. Córdoba, the crown jewel of Al-Andalus, was by the 10th century the largest and most cultured city in all of Europe. It boasted a population of 500,000, far exceeding any other European city of the period. Its streets were well paved and lit with lamps every night. Street lighting in an era when London and Paris were dark, muddy hamlets. Córdoba had advanced aqueducts bringing in fresh water, hundreds of public baths, and hospitals that provided actual medical treatment based on the best available knowledge. In Moorish cities, one could find well-stocked bookshops and libraries. Music and poetry filled the air. Scholars debated philosophy and science in the bustling marketplaces. It is no exaggeration to say Moorish Spain was the most enlightened land in Europe, and it was Africa's gift to Europe. One of the most profound contributions the Moors made was in the realm of science and technology. They served as conduits, carrying the knowledge of the ancient world, much of which had been preserved and expanded by Africans and Arabs into Europe. Mathematics is a prime example. The numeric digits 0 to 9 that we use today, often called Arabic numerals, were introduced to Europe through the Moors. In fact, the very concept of zero, an idea so fundamental to math and science, was alien to Europeans until Muslim scholars taught it to them. In Moorish Spain, one could find mathematicians solving complex algebraic equations centuries before Europeans would fully catch up. An Italian traveller named Leonardo of Pisa, better known as Fibonacci, visited the Moorish lands of North Africa as a boy and learned these advanced mathematical concepts, including the Hindu-Arabic numeral system, with 0 from African teachers in Béjaïa, Algeria. He later introduced these numerals to Italy in 1202, revolutionizing European commerce and science. So if you're grateful, you don't have to do long division in clunky Roman numerals. Thank the African and Islamic scholars who gifted Europe a superior number system. Astronomy and medicine also flourished under the Moors. They built observatories to gaze at the stars, charting planetary movements at a time when the average European believed the sky was fixed and finite. Moorish astronomers in Spain created detailed astronomical tables and designed instruments like the astrolabe, a sophisticated tool for navigation and timekeeping, which would later guide European explorers across the oceans. In medicine, Moorish physicians followed in the footsteps of the great North African doctor Ibn Zor and philosopher-physician Ibn Rushd, pioneering surgical techniques and medical textbooks that Europe would adopt as standard references. The first hospitals in Europe since Roman times were established in Al-Andalus, where illnesses were treated with medications and empirical methods rather than medieval quackery. Even aviation saw its dawn in Moorish Spain. A polymath inventor named Abbas ibn Firnas, a Berber Andalusian and thus an African by heritage, conducted one of the world's earliest recorded experiments in human flight in the 9th century. He fashioned wings of silk and wood and leapt from a height, gliding briefly before crash landing, the first glider flight in history, centuries before Leonardo da Vinci sketched his flying machines. It was a daring, brilliant attempt, and it happened on European soil under African Muslim auspices, at a time when the idea of flight would have seemed like sorcery to Northern Europeans. Culturally, too, the impact was immense. The Spanish language today bears over 4,000 words of Arabic origin, evidence of the deep influence of the Moors. The very concept of chivalry in medieval Europe was shaped in part by contact with refined Moorish courts, where poetry and courtesy were valued. Music in Spain was transformed by Moorish musicians. One famous figure, Ziryab, was a talented black musician who arrived in Córdoba from Baghdad. Ziryab revolutionized fashion, cuisine, and musical style in Spain. He introduced new musical instruments like the oud, precursor to the lute and guitar, and even the idea of eating in courses, soup to start, then main dish, then dessert. Imagine something as everyday as the sequence of a formal meal, coming from an African trendsetter in the 9th century. By the year 1000, thanks to Africa's civilizing influence, Europe was on an upward trajectory. Al-Andalus had set an example that slowly but surely pulled the rest of Europe forward, sometimes by inspiration, sometimes by competition. The Renaissance of the 12th century occurred as Latin Christian scholars finally gained access to the vast body of knowledge preserved in Arabic. They translated works on astronomy, medicine, philosophy, and mathematics from Arabic into Latin. Virtually all of those Arabic manuscripts were obtained either through the libraries of Moorish Spain or via North African and Middle Eastern connections. It is no exaggeration to say that European civilization was reactivated and accelerated by this infusion of African and Arab knowledge. They literally civilized large parts of Europe's wild tribes, dragging them out of ignorance. And so for more than 700 years, the mostly African Moors ruled parts of the Iberian Peninsula. But no empire lasts forever. By the late 15th century, the political tides had turned. Christian kingdoms in the north of Spain, having slowly reconquered territory in fits and starts, a long process they called the Reconquista, were poised to strike the final blow. In January 1492, the last Moorish stronghold, the Kingdom of Granada, fell to the armies of Queen Isabella of Castile and King Ferdinand of Aragon. The fall of Granada was greeted with fanatical zeal by Christian Europe. Church bells rang from Rome to London to celebrate what was framed as a triumph of Christianity over the African infidels on European soil. Yet, in reality, it was the beginning of a tragic era, one in which the lights of tolerance, scholarship, and multicultural richness in Spain were snuffed out, and a concerted effort was made to erase the African contributions to European civilization. Immediately after their victory, the Spanish monarchs and church authorities began a campaign to cleanse Spain of Muslim and Jewish presence. They could not tolerate the reminder that a vibrant cosmopolitan civilization led by Africans had thrived where their rule now stood. Thus began the Spanish Inquisition and the expulsion of the Moors. By 1502, remaining Muslims were ordered to convert to Christianity or leave. Many who converted were still mistrusted, and eventually in 1609, even those descendants of Moors who had become Christian were expelled en masse. Some 300,000 people, essentially the last traces of Moorish heritage, violently uprooted. King Philip III of Spain's expulsion order in 1609 stands as one of history's early examples of ethnic cleansing. The African Muslims who had guided Spain to greatness were forced out, their books burned, their achievements quickly appropriated or obliterated. The mood in the new Christian Spain was not one of gratitude for what the Moors had given, but rather one of anxious denial. Generations of Spanish rulers literally tried to wipe this era from the record. They destroyed Arabic manuscripts or locked them away unread. They renovated or demolished the architectural masterpieces of the Moors, converting the great mosque of Córdoba into a cathedral, building Baroque facades over exquisite Islamic palaces. They rewrote chronicles to portray the Moors not as bearers of light, but as cruel invaders who had oppressed Spain, conveniently forgetting that many local Spaniards had lived peacefully and productively under Moorish rule for centuries. History, as told by the victors, was being twisted. The African civilization in Europe was painted over with the colours of bigotry and myth. This deliberate forgetting was aided by the passage of time. As the Renaissance and then the Enlightenment unfolded in Europe, many Europeans came to take pride in their revival of classical learning. Few acknowledged that much of that classical learning had reached them via African and Islamic scholars. It was easier, and certainly more flattering, to imagine that Europeans had rediscovered their ancient Greek and Roman roots entirely on their own. The African bridge that connected antiquity to modern Europe was omitted from the narrative. By the 18th and 19th centuries, eurocentric historians were openly minimizing Africa's role. Some even propagated the notion that North Africans and Egyptians were actually white or Semitic peoples. Anything to avoid admitting that black or brown Africans had built great civilizations. They concocted wild theories that the real Egyptians had been light-skinned, despite ancient descriptions to the contrary, or that the achievements of Mali or Songhai were due to Arab influence. It was an intentional program of diminishment and erasure of Africans from history. And the motive was clear. By the 16th century onward, European nations were engaging in the transatlantic slave trade and the colonization of Africa. To justify the enslavement and exploitation of African people, they cultivated the lie that Africans were uncivilized and contributed nothing to world progress. The truth that Europe owed a profound debt to African civilizations was inconvenient and had to be suppressed. Yet, even as those falsehoods took root in popular imagination, the facts never disappeared entirely. They survived in the stone ruins of great African cities, in the records of Greek historians like Herodotus, who described Egypt as a land of black-skinned people advanced in wisdom, in the Arabic books that escaped the Inquisition's fires, and in the very fabric of European culture, in words and inventions whose African origins could be traced by the diligent. By the 20th century, scholars, some from Africa and the African diaspora, like Cheikh Anta Diop, began to loudly challenge the old historiography. Diop used rigorous research to demonstrate that the ancient Egyptians were predominantly black Africans, and that their civilization seeded much of what we cherish in Western and Near Eastern heritage. Others highlighted the achievements of medieval African kingdoms and the debt Europe owed them. Slowly, the truth has been resurfacing. It often meets resistance because acknowledging Africa's role requires a humbling of European pride and a confrontation with the racist ideologies of the recent past. But facts are stubborn things. It is a fact that Moorish Spain was the most advanced part of Europe for centuries. It is a fact that Africans and people of African descent played indispensable roles in preserving and transmitting ancient knowledge to medieval Europe. It is a fact that African wealth, gold from Ghana for example, kick-started the European age of exploration. Even Christopher Columbus's voyage was enabled by navigational science perfected by Moors and by the Spanish appetite for resources that had been sparked by contact with Africa. And it is a painful fact that, having benefited so greatly, Europe turned around and ravaged Africa, then lied about African inferiority to excuse its crimes. Today, a renaissance of historical truth is underway. Scholars and storytellers alike are piecing together the fragments of Africa's pivotal influence on Europe, and the world is starting to listen. The task is neither easy nor complete. Remnants of the old false narratives still linger, but at least the veil is lifting. We have seen that the erasure of Africa's role was not an innocent oversight, but part and parcel of the ideology that justified slavery and colonial exploitation. Understanding this helps us see the modern world's inequalities in a new light. The false narrative of African inferiority was constructed to rationalize economic greed. Dismantling that narrative is therefore more than an academic exercise, because it strikes at the heart of ongoing racial prejudices and inequities. As we conclude, picture, if you will, a symbolic scene. In a grand hall of what could be a world museum, a new exhibit is unveiled. At the center stands a tall torch, the flame of civilization. On one side of the torch stands a figure representing Africa, perhaps an Egyptian scholar in robes or a Moorish astronomer with an astrolabe. On the other side stands a figure representing Europe, perhaps a medieval European monk or a Renaissance artist. In the tableau, the African sage is passing the flame to the European, not extinguishing his own, but sharing it, lighting the other's torch. That is the image of history as it truly happened. Africa's flame lit the way for Europe, and in time, Europe would carry that flame onward. How tragic that the Museum of our collective memory tried to hide the African sage in the shadows, leaving only the European figure bragging about holding the fire. It is time to set the record straight and place both figures in the light where they belong. History tried to hide the fact that Africa civilized Europe, but no more. We have recovered the lost chapters and found that they were shining all along. The oppressed have a proud past to celebrate, and the oppressors have a chance to seek redemption through truth. Let this knowledge burn bright, and let no one ever again dare say that any people lack a history or have contributed nothing. Africa's light has guided the world and will continue to do so as long as we remember. If this video opened your eyes, share it and let it open someone else's too. Like this video, subscribe to the channel and drop a comment below. Tell us what part of Africa's story you think the world needs to hear next. Your voice helps spread the truth, and more untold chapters are coming. Thank you for watching. See you in the next one.